The worst 4chan thread I have ever seen is live right now, and it is a group of people desperately trying to justify the 2000s Zelda cycle backlash, right? I'm seeing a bunch of people trying to say Wind Waker was bad, Twilight Princess was bad, Skyward Sword was bad. These people would probably say Minish Cap, the Oracle games, Four Swords Adventures, and everything else that came out around that time period were bad as well, right? It was, if they knew what they were. It's really interesting because we've reached the point where people are nostalgic for the Zelda cycle. For those of you who aren't aware, like the Zelda cycle in the 2000s was the tendency among Zelda fans to pretend as if the previous title in the series was way better than the last one. Of course, so Wind Waker was compared negatively to Majora's Mask. Twilight Princess was compared negatively to Wind Waker, and Skyward Sword was negatively compared to Twilight Princess. It was like a trend, right? It was a typical trap set forward by game journalists trying to promote PlayStation to try and trick you into thinking that Zelda was a declining property when in reality it was setting the stage to becoming one of the biggest properties on the planet with Breath of the Wild, right? Nobody wants to admit it. Nobody wants to admit that, like, the Zelda cycle was always crap, that all of these games are great, right? And right now it seems that the Pretendos are trying to establish a narrative. They are trying to establish this idea that they were in the right to be unhappy with Zelda, with the direction it was taking, with Nintendo's marketing, with their direction, with their creators, and really, all of it is falling flat on its face. Really, real talk. Like, the more and more I think back to playing Wind Waker, playing Twilight Princess, playing Skyward Sword, especially playing Skyward Sword, the more I appreciate just how good these games actually are, how much they did for me as a creator, like, and how much time I've put into them over the years. Like, I've done several playthroughs of all of those Zelda games, and more I start to realize that as I get older that, like, wow, I've put more time into Zelda than I have any other franchise, right? And it's not just because it's my favorite, right? It's not just because that, like, I have a preference for it or it's like my thing. It's because they're good, right? Like, I became a fan because I love these games. And because these games are so well made, because they're so, like, well known among the community, because they were, like, system sellers for Nintendo, they were seen as a big deal because, Ocarina of Time was the best game ever made at the time. You see, like, you saw a lot of people around that time period, like, trying desperately to downplay them, telling you that, like, Nintendo really lost sight of, like, what made this series great and that you should buy a PlayStation instead. And make no mistake, like, when people talk trash about, like, ooh, Space World 2000, when they talk about how Nintendo underwhelmed them with Wind Waker, like, Majora's Mask came out in 2000, right? Darkest Zelda game ever, still is the darkest Zelda game ever, I would say. And people thought it was too difficult, right? Like, I don't understand this. Like, Majora's Mask was fairly unpopular when it came out because of how convoluted it was and how different it was. What a drastic change in direction from Ocarina it was. Like, it made sense to deviate from that a little bit with Wind Waker, right? Like, I think Wind Waker was a much more accessible game that was more appealing to kids and people who had never played Zelda before, right? Like, it made sense to put out something like Wind Waker after Majora's Mask, but nobody ever wants to see it that way. Like, all anybody wants to do is complain about, ooh, the Triforce Hunt, ooh, the visuals, ooh, the lack of difficulty, when all of that really does lead to, like, a very well-received Zelda game among first-time players, right? Like, Wind Waker does have a reputation for being one of those games that a lot of people who have never played a video game before can get into, right? Like, I remember playing Wind Waker for the first time and being really impressed with it, with the animations, with the designs, with just the general structure in general. Like, I really liked it from the get-go, and, like, the complaints about the visual style, I think, were very, very unwarranted. I've always thought that, right? That's always been, like, my thing is just that like the backlash towards the visuals always felt very fake to me, right? Like Wind Waker was clearly better produced than a lot of games that were coming out around the same time. Games like Devil May Cry, Onimusha, let's see, what else? Beautiful Joe. Like, I would say Wind Waker is better than all of that, right? Nobody, people were making excuses for not being excited for GameCube games until Resident Evil 4 came out, which conveniently, by the way, is a rated M for mature game. Like, people were convinced that the GameCube had nothing good for it at all, right? And it's just so laughable to look back on now, considering just how beloved the GameCube is. But like there really was like a very real agenda, set forward by game journalists to try and downplay every major Nintendo game that came out. Right, Luigi's Mansion was shit on. Right, Pikmin, I'm sure was shit on to a certain extent. Like, Sunshine was shit on. Well, Sunshine deserves it to a certain extent. There there's a very real like agenda against Nintendo at that time period. And because game journalism was so prominent, because like people thought that gaming magazines were reliable sources of information, people took this stuff very, very seriously. And as a result of that, like a lot of them don't know that that's where all this information was coming from. It wasn't people reacting live to Space World 2000. It was game journalists like reporting on the event, reporting on how disappointed they were and how Nintendo really lost their way and how PlayStation is the future. And 10 years later, we would, slowly start to realize that like game journalists were not to be trusted at all in any way, shape, or form, right? We began to understand just how this industry actually works and what's actually going on behind the scenes. And these people are heavily, heavily controlled and aren't really allowed to like deviate and like praise good games or go after like bad ones, right? Like how many people do you see like talking about how bad Spider-Man PS4 was, or God of War Ragnarok, or The Last of Us Part 2, right? Like those are terrible, terrible games, right? Everybody agrees, but game journalists are pretending game journalists spent their time like hyping them up and pretending they were like masterpieces, especially in the case of like The Last of Us Part 2. It's just the backlash towards Nintendo products has always been fake. It's always been astroturfed. It's always been like pushed by the media. But like over the years, it's just kind of collapsed among itself, right? And now like with the rise of Nintendo Switch Online, like the narrative seems to be shifting to trying to drive away Zoomers from experiencing this game. That seems to be the thing. Like what they're doing now is they're trying to like go after Nintendo's legacy, trying to tell you that like these classic games aren't all that great and that you shouldn't play them, that you shouldn't care about them at all, that like if you're younger, like you wouldn't appreciate them or like you wouldn't enjoy them at all. And I really don't think that's true at all, because I've already seen like a lot of younger people I know, playing Donkey Kong Country, playing Super Mario Bros, playing Ocarina, playing like a lot of these classic Zelda games, like a lot of these classic Nintendo games. And being someone who grew up, getting excited when I learned about Donkey Kong, the arcade game, for the first time through Donkey Kong 64, when I had never heard of it before, like, you really do understand that, like, no, kids can appreciate classic games. They can appreciate this older stuff. They can appreciate, like, more archaic design and, like, more streamlined games. They can't appreciate stuff like Wind Waker, like Majora's Mask, like Twilight Princess, like Skyward Sword, if they put in the time and effort, right? And I think that is very apparent. Like, it's observable reality. But right now, we're seeing a lot of people do their absolute best to try and pretend as if that's not going to happen, right? People really do seem to think that like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are going to be like the defining Zelda games going forward, and that we're never going to see like a traditional Zelda game ever at all. And it's only a matter of time until we get like a nostalgic throwback to this era of 3D Zelda. And when that happens, a lot of people are going to be very happy. I myself, the only real complaint I had with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom was that these were the best games ever made, but they were not traditional 3D Zelda games. So, I can already tell you that the instant Nintendo does that they put out like, a nostalgic throwback, like 3D Zelda game, like a lot of fans like myself are going to be very, very happy.